topic. There is a handout. If the screen is not as legible as it could be, the handout should be even better, so don't worry about the screen. This is a topic that kind of caught my attention last year. I was teaching the Gospel of Matthew at church and here in a class at Florida College, and I always thought I understood what was going on in Matthew 22, where the Sadducees asked this question to Jesus, until I got to thinking about the context of it, and then all of a sudden I didn't understand anything, it seems. And so what you're going to get here is kind of the little rabbit that I chased for a couple months as I tried to think through this. It is sometimes suggested that the confrontations that Jesus has with the religious authorities the week before his death were designed to discredit Jesus. I think there is some truth to that, but there's certainly a lot more to it than that. If you read the gospel accounts, very, very early in the accounts, and I've listed some scriptures there on the handout, Matthew 12, but as early as Luke chapter 6, it says that after a couple run-ins in the synagogues in Galilee, that the religious leaders were getting together to figure out what they should do to Jesus. And it doesn't take a PhD in rhetoric to figure out what they meant by that, right? That they're thinking, we're not going to put up with this. We're not going to have this. And over throughout the story, we are told that as the time goes on, this gets more and more critical. It's especially prominent in the Gospel of John. As early as John chapter 5, they're picking up stones to kill Jesus. So by the time we get to the last week of Jesus' life, the religious leaders are in a bind. They want Jesus dead. They've already made that decision a long time ago. The problem is that they have no legal grounds on which to execute him. And outright murder was not an option. And that's the part of the story that always gets me. Because once you decide you're going to kill somebody, isn't that murder? And then we can't just go out and kill him. Well, isn't that what you've decided to do, just to kill him? No, but we don't want to touch him. We want the Romans to do this. They need to get the Romans involved, of course, for it to be legal. So what happens in this last week is that you get these religious groups lining up, as you are familiar, to trap Jesus with a question. In Luke chapter 20 and in verse 20, it says, they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous in order that they might catch him in some statement so that they could deliver him to the rule and the authority of the governor. So the idea is to get him to say something that is worthy of a capital crime. And so you recall that the groups take turns trying to pose these trick questions, and the Sadducees ask a question about levirate marriage. Now, there is a sense to this in which this is actually a brilliant question, because if it works, they can say to the Pharisees, see, you guys are wrong. And it will trap Jesus at the same time. So it kind of kills two birds with one stone. But the question we want to ask this morning is, how could a question about levirate marriage get a guy killed? What is so dangerous about a question about levirate marriage? You remember the question they asked, that there was a man among us, they said, there were 7 brothers among us, and the first guy married a woman and he died before they could bear children. So according to levirate marriage, the second guy has her, and then he dies, and then the third brother takes her. And if I'm the third brother, I'm thinking, If I'm brother number 5 or 6, I'm certainly think, no way. But this is the story they tell. And the question is, okay, Jesus, in the resurrection, who's going to be the husband and the wife, the legitimate husband and wife pair here? And how does that get you killed? What if Jesus says it's guy number 3? Is there some kind of tradition that says, if you pick guy number 3, we hand you over to the Romans? No, there's nothing like that. What if he picks guy number 5? It seems that the worst that this question could do is generate some disagreement. But how does this get Jesus killed? So that's what we want to answer in the next few minutes. We'll begin with the Sadducees and their question. I guess there's not going to be a slideshow. It's okay. I'll talk while she's working. The Sadducees, of course, do not believe in a future resurrection of the dead. It's a well-known fact among Bible students. Now, before we go any further, we have to remember that I think very often we think of resurrection as something that's going to happen to me and going to happen to you, but the Jews understood that resurrection is about the nation. It's not just about individuals, that resurrection is about the future of the nation. So keep that in mind, because that's very important. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us that the Sadducees do not believe in resurrection. We have similar testimony from ancient sources. One at the bottom of page 1 on your handout is from Jewish writings when the heretics, the Sadducees in this particular case, corrupted the practice, and the practice here was of concluding all blessings said in the temple with the word forever, and said there is but one world, but no world to come. Thank you. I'll get back here. But there's no world to come. The rabbis then made a rule and said that when you say blessings in the temple, you have to end it with the phrase forever and ever, thereby suggesting the existence of a world to come. Now, it's kind of interesting that what we learn from this text is that the Sadducees have denied a future coming world. Sadducees take away the belief of the immortal duration of the soul and the punishments and the rewards in Hades. That is from Josephus, Jewish Wars, Book 2. And he says also in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, that the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that the souls die with the bodies. Now, where did they get this idea? Well, this is supposedly related to their insistence on the primacy of just the first 5 books of the Bible. I have to tell you that personally I am suspicious of that explanation. There's some things about it that just don't make sense, but this is the reason that has often been cited. And so Josephus says this, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. And of course, if you think about it for a second, that can't be true on its face, because there's lots of things that the Sadducees had to do that are not written in the law of Moses. So this is just an overstatement. He said, they think it an instant of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent, but this doctrine is received by but a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity. The fact is probably that all Jews regarded the Torah as having a higher status than the rest of the books of the Old Testament. I think we could make that argument and make a case for that pretty easily. So how are the Sadducees different? Well, apparently, and we just don't know the details, but apparently the Sadducees had kind of an extreme view about this. Now, the fact that they posed a story to Jesus about resurrection has led some people to suggest that the question is designed to prove that according to Sadducean beliefs, therefore, there cannot be a resurrection. In other words, the point of the little story is that if there is a resurrection, then there will be this hopelessly confusing situation that could not be solved, and as a matter of fact, it would be God who created this hopelessly confusing situation, because levirate marriage came from God. And furthermore, I think they would say that if God is going to raise the dead, then we didn't need levirate law in the first place, did we? So the fact that things are the way they are, according to the Sadducean way of thinking, means that there cannot possibly be a resurrection. And I think there's an element of truth to that. I do think that one of the things that their little story is trying to do is to prove that there is no resurrection. But there's more at stake. There's got to be more at stake here than simply the proving that Jesus could answer this question incorrectly. How would this result in the death of Jesus? The fact is that we know that this has to be more than just a question about resurrection. First of all, before we get to that point, nothing in this context has mentioned resurrection. Jesus hasn't said a word about it since he got into town. The crowds haven't been talking about it. The religious leaders didn't bring it up. And so unless this is just a random question from the Sadducees, and I don't think they're that stupid to just ask random questions, or unless it is just an honest attempt on the part of the Sadducees to say, you know what, Jesus, here's something we've never been able to figure out. We'd really like your opinion. I don't think they're doing that either. Then levirate marriage and the resurrection are not what this question is about. These are only surface issues. The real thing that they're getting at is somewhere deeper. And the fact is that we know from the writings of Josephus, from the writings of the Qumran group who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things, that the Jews in ancient times tolerated a very wide latitude of ideas on certain subjects. And one of the subjects in which they tolerated each other quite well was on the subject of resurrection. It is well known among Bible students that not all the Jews thought there would be resurrection. Paul uses this to his advantage. In Acts 23, he looked at the Sanhedrin. He said, I know some of these guys believe in resurrection and some don't. And resurrection wasn't the only issue on which there was agreement and toleration. What was the correct calendar to use? The Jews disagreed about that. How do we apply the cleanliness laws? The Jews disagreed about that. The Pharisees had kind of their view of it. Other groups had other views of that. What about fate? What about freedom of the will? What about the existence of ghosts? What are the proper grounds for divorce? The Jews had all kinds of opinions about these things. And the fact is that they tolerated each other over them. They did not the Pharisees never persecuted the Sadducees for disagreeing with them over any of these subjects. And likewise, the Sadducees didn't persecute the Pharisees or anything like that. And so the question of resurrection is not something that they killed each other over. It is extremely unlikely, given the historical evidence that we have, that giving the wrong answer to a question about resurrection would have threatened Jesus' life at all. Especially when the Pharisees have what was unquestionably a minority view. These guys hold the minority view when it comes to resurrection. There's no way that Jesus is going to lose his life over this situation. And so there is this kind of weird situation here. Why ask this question over which it is well known that the Jews tolerate each other if this is not a question that will achieve the purpose of getting Jesus killed? And therein is the problem that struck me when I was teaching the Gospel of Matthew not too long ago. That what do they think they're going to accomplish with this question? How do they think this is going to get Jesus put on a cross? Everything that we know about the ancient context says that this would not have done it. You have to realize that this is a trick question. You've heard this before. Imagine you're driving a bus. You have 6 people on the bus. At the next stop, 7 more people get on, and 2 get off. At the next stop, 5 get on, 6 get off. The next stop after that, 1 person gets on, 3 people get off. And you do that for a couple minutes, and then you say, how tall is the bus driver? And you're like, oh, I didn't catch that part, right? Well, yeah, you're driving a bus. And what the question is done has diverted your attention away from the real issue. It got you thinking about math and throwing all these numbers at you. And when you get the addition and the subtraction wrong, you think you're fine. Well, I think I got the number. And then how tall is the bus driver? Like, ooh, didn't even think about that. And so we have that same kind of thing here. There were 7 brothers. Each one of these brothers is married to this woman at some point in the situation. And so in the resurrection, which one's wife will she be? Now you're thinking, well, I might pick guy number 1 because he's the first husband, and that would be the best scenario from the biblical perspective. Or I might pick guy number 7 because he's the last husband, and he would have the claim because all these other husbands are dead, and he is the rightful husband after all in this situation. But the question is not about which brother. The question is in the resurrection. That's the question. It's a what-if kind of question, and it works by diverting Jesus' attention from the real issue. I don't think this is describing a real historical situation. I have a footnote about that. Some people have thought that there might be some kind of source that we can track down to that. But it's designed to get Jesus to thinking about which husband, when in fact what they want to ask him is about resurrection. You say, no, wait a minute. Didn't we just say that questions about resurrection could not get Jesus killed? And yes, that is true. Picking guy number 3 or guy number 6 would not have gotten Jesus killed. It is the implications of resurrection that holds the real trap here. Let me ask you a fundamental Bible question that you may never have thought of. Why is there a biblical doctrine about resurrection anyway? Why is that doctrine in the Bible? Why does there have to be a resurrection? And the answer is because of the kingdom. In my opinion, this is why the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. It's not that it's because they only thought we're only going to accept whatever's in the first 5 books of Moses, and resurrection's mentioned in Daniel and Ezekiel, and we don't accept that. No, I think the real reason the Sadducees don't believe in resurrection is because they don't believe in a future kingdom. They believe that the promised kingdom of God was already here, and it was them. Remember, the Sadducees are the aristocrats. The Sadducees are the social elite. Their life is going pretty good. Now, there are a lot of Jewish people suffering in this time. The Romans have made a very difficult situation for a lot of people, but the Sadducees, they're living very well. They have no need for a Messiah to come along and wipe things out. They have no need for a Messiah to come along and kick the Romans out of the country. The Romans are what give the Sadducees and these people all their money and their status. They have no interest in some future kingdom. They think, oh, the kingdom's already here. We're in it. It's us. And so they don't believe in resurrection because it ruins their whole program to think otherwise. Emil Schur said this, that by denying resurrection and immortality in general, the Sadducees rejected simultaneously the entire messianic hope in the form, at least in which later Judaism, built on Pharisaic foundations, expressed it. Rudolf Meyer, in Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, a work that many of you are familiar with, says that to have the mind of the Zadokites, or Sadducee is to be sustained by the concept of a particularist temple state, which along the lines of traditional eschatological hopes is the seed for the purification of the Holy Land, its liberation from all Gentiles and semi-Gentiles, and the restoration of the idealized kingdom of Israel as David once reigned over it. All this, of course, with the proviso that the actual historical epoch under which the sign of the princely rule would be the Hasmonean house, and that is them. Did they believe that God had a kingdom? Yes. Did they believe that this kingdom would get better? Yes. But at the end of the day, they believed that they were this kingdom. Josephus says this: concerning these things it is said that great disputes and differences have arisen among them, while the Sadducees are able to persuade only the rich, and the populace does not follow them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. What Josephus is telling us there is that the Sadducees had a lot more to lose by the coming kingdom of God than anybody else. The rich people had everything to lose if the kingdom was still to come. Because if you take those prophecies seriously in the Old Testament, it talks about there being a war, it talks about the current situation being overthrown, the kingdom of God appearing in place of the old corrupt kingdom, and the Sadducees are, I like what we got. I don't want somebody coming along and overthrowing what we've got. They thought they were the kingdom and that everything was fine. But the Pharisees, you'll recall, believed that God's kingdom had not yet arrived on the earth. Why not? Well, because they looked around and said, this can't be the kingdom of God. Things have got to be better for us if this is really the kingdom of God. So if you believe that the kingdom of God hasn't gotten here yet, the next question is, okay, what about the people who die before it gets here? Do they miss out on the kingdom of God? Is it just bad luck on their part? No, the biblical answer is God will raise them from the dead so that they can be part of the kingdom when it comes. That's why there is a biblical doctrine of resurrection. It has to do with the coming of the kingdom. And that if you are dead before the kingdom arrives, it doesn't mean that you just miss out on it. Because the day will come when God will raise you from the dead and you will get to be part of the kingdom. But if the kingdom is already here, then you're not missing out on anything. You get to live in the kingdom of God, you get to enjoy its blessings, and when you die, you die. You've had your time in the kingdom of God. That's what the Sadducees believe. And so, it is this question of the kingdom that is driving this question to Jesus. One thing is clear if you look at this point in the gospel narratives that leads up to this context, that Jesus has been announcing the arrival of God's kingdom. And the strong implication of everything that Jesus was doing is that he was the Messianic King. Now you remember, Jesus didn't let people call him that because when they said it, they meant something different than Jesus meant by it, and he didn't want them using that faulty interpretation of it. But Jesus implied strongly by his actions that he was the coming Messianic King. He was proclaiming the arrival of the kingdom of God, and it was to be a kingdom of the poor and the unclean. Imagine you're a Pharisee, and you're watching Jesus. He's making a kingdom. What kind of kingdom is it? The rabble, the unclean, the ignorant, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them available. If you're a Pharisee or a Sadducee, you're thinking, no. We're not going to let a kingdom like that start. This is not the kingdom that God's going to send us, a kingdom full of poor, ignorant, unclean people. You think about the context in the ministry of Jesus. What did Jesus do right before all these questions were thrown at him? He had entered into Jerusalem and he had cleansed the temple. And both of these actions were interpreted by the religious authorities correctly. That is, that these things had messianic, that is, kingdom implications, kingdom overtones. You remember when Jesus came into the city in his triumphal entry, what are the crowds saying? They're quoting Psalm 118, verse 26. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And in Luke's version of that, here's what the crowds say. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. They've altered that quotation a little bit to express what they think that passage is talking about. That we think Psalm 118 is about the coming of the Messiah, the King, and they say those words as Jesus is riding the donkey into Jerusalem. And remember, the Pharisees say, Jesus, make your disciples be quiet. This is blasphemous. They shouldn't be doing that. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to tell them to shut up. They're exactly right. You're the ones that can't see the truth here. They see it. And then what did Jesus do? He went in and he cleansed the temple. And everybody understood what that meant. Malachi chapter 3, the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come into his temple. And it's not a pretty picture when he does. And Zechariah 14, that said that when the kingdom comes, when the Lord comes, that God will take his temple back for himself. The implication being that it was in the hands of people who shouldn't have it. That the kingdom that had it had no right to it, and God would take it back. And when Jesus marched into the temple and threw everybody out and threw the furniture around and drove out the animals, everybody understood what Jesus was doing. He was acting out Malachi and Zechariah and announcing that the kingdom has come, it is here, God has come into his temple and he is claiming it back for himself. In every way, Jesus was proclaiming a kingdom that was against everything that the religious leaders believed and hoped for. And so, this put them into a difficult situation. Because in addition to their theological objections, politically the religious leaders could not support or ignore messianic actions in their city. If somebody's going around doing things that makes him look like a king, and the Jews do nothing about it, they understand the Romans will. You remember the discussion in John 11 after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead? In John 11:48, Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead. It's just a great wonderful miracle. Everybody is talking about it, and the high priest and his buddies get together, and everybody's saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the high priest says, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to kill Jesus. That's what we're going to do. Better that one man die than the Romans come and kill us all, because if we let this kingdom stuff go on that Jesus is doing, that's exactly what will happen. The Romans will come and kill us all. So they have to do something about this. And that's why they start asking these questions. You remember the question that the Pharisees asked. It's a pretty easy question to figure out. Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Obviously a loaded question. If Jesus can't answer the question, then he has contradicted himself. And this completely diffuses his entire kingdom program. Come on, Jesus. You're supposed to be the king. You're the coming king, right? What are you going to do about the Romans? Should we pay taxes to the Romans? Should we acknowledge Roman authority? Or are you the new king around here? So the question is designed to trap Jesus into contradicting himself. If he says, yes, we should pay taxes to the Romans, then, so you're not going to be the king. Or if you are the king, you're not going to be much of a king. You're going to let the Romans still run the place, right? Or if Jesus says, no, stop paying Roman taxes, then he has advocated that Roman rule is not legitimate, and that, of course, will get him killed. All they have to do is say, well, we're going to go tell the Romans that you're out here proclaiming a kingdom and you don't have to support Rome anymore, and that'll get Jesus killed pretty quickly. And if Jesus did say, well, yeah, I think that you should keep paying taxes to the Romans, that answer itself probably would have got him killed by the mob, who was expecting the Messiah to come and do away with the Romans. So it's a pretty good question. But you remember how Jesus answered it. It's not an either or. Give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. What's the problem? But for the Sadducees, what Jesus did in the temple was a criticism of them. That's why in Luke chapter 20, we have that little parable that goes on. In Luke 20, the parable, Luke 20 verses 9 and following, the parable of the vine growers. And Jesus accuses them and their authority and their management of the temple. Jesus says, I'm not the one who has to answer for the temple here, it's you. This is God's vineyard. You're the vine dressers. Why haven't you done anything with it? And so the Sadducees' question was really an objection to the kingdom that Jesus claimed to be bringing. The question was designed not just to prove that there's no resurrection, but to prove that there can't be such a kingdom as Jesus was announcing. And so the trap worked like this, that if Jesus cannot answer their question, then he has to admit that there is no coming kingdom, and that he is not the king, and he's not bringing God's kingdom. If Jesus answers their question as he has stated it, whatever brother Jesus picks out of the seven, then the Sadducees say, oh, you do believe in a resurrection. And if he believes in a resurrection, then he believes that there is a coming kingdom. And if you were to ask Jesus, oh, you do believe in a resurrection, so you must believe in that the kingdom of God is coming. And by the way, who's going to be the king in this kingdom? Jesus would say, well, me. I mean, this is how they envision it. They think Jesus is that stupid, right? That, oh, that's me. Yeah, I'm going to be the king. But they think they've got him. They think they've got Jesus here to where if he answers either way, that he has either contradicted himself and ruined his own kingdom program, or that he is claiming to be the coming king, and all that the Sadducees have to do is go and tell the Romans that there is a man in the temple talking about resurrection because the kingdom is coming and he says he's going to be the king. And so that is how a question about marriage can get Jesus killed. So very quickly, in the last couple minutes that we have, how does Jesus diffuse this? Well, you know as Bible students that Jesus picks a passage from their Bible, from the Torah, from the book of Exodus, where God speaks to Moses at the burning bush. It's kind of interesting. I'm not exactly clear myself as to how Jesus' argument actually works. You remember that Jesus says that in the passage at the burning bush, God is called the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I think in Matthew's account, Jesus quotes, it says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, what does that argument really mean? I've listed three possibilities here on your outline. It could be that the passage implies that Abraham has not ceased to exist. And if there is an intermediate state, then there must be a resurrection, because in the Jewish way of thinking, you don't live forever as a disembodied spirit. You have to get a body sometime. So if you believe in spirits, you believe in resurrection. It might be that the passage can be read as a promise. When God says, I am the God of Abraham, that's a guarantee that Abraham will live again. Or thirdly, it could be that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is meant to remind them that you remember Abraham and Sarah couldn't have children, but I gave them children. And you remember that Isaac and Rebekah couldn't have children, but I gave them children. I'm the God who makes life. It could be that that's how the argument works. I'll let you decide which you think is the better. A fourth possibility on the last page of your outline is that the passage shows that those who belong to God will share in God's own life. But regardless of how the argument actually works, the point is that God's words to Moses clearly imply some kind of future for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Sadducees knew it. Now remember, the Sadducees claim to follow the Pentateuch in a special way. So Jesus has used their own Bible to prove them wrong. And Jesus has trapped them in exactly the way that they thought they would trap him. They said, we've got a great question, because the question makes an implication, and the implication makes another implication. Pick a brother. That means you believe in resurrection. If you believe in resurrection, you believe in kingdom. But what Jesus has done is he has said, tell me about Exodus 3. What's the implication of that statement? The implication is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are going to live. They could not deny the plain implication of the statement in Exodus, which is to say, okay, Jesus, we're wrong. You're right. And if their own Bible clearly implies there will be a resurrection, then what this means is that there will be a coming kingdom, and that what the Sadducees are doing is not the kingdom of God, that they are wrong, that they are the vine growers in the parable who have not handled God's vineyard correctly. And if they are not the kingdom of God after all, then the possibility is still open that Jesus is bringing the kingdom of God and that he is the kingdom, the king. And so if you want to go and tell the Romans that I believe in a coming kingdom, you go right ahead. And when the Romans ask me, where did you get this idea? I'm going to say, I got it from the book that the Sadducees have been teaching. They're not going to do that. I hope our study today has been helpful. Thank you for your kind attention.